Routine is not a ritual for good luck. Routine is a control system for your brain. Markets open with noise, speed, and incomplete information. Without a deliberate boot sequence, your state is set by the first tick that surprises you, the first headline that spikes arousal, or the first candle that reminds you of yesterday. With a deliberate boot sequence, your state is set by design. You decide what a good day means. You decide which conditions allow action. You decide how much risk the machine is allowed to consume. And you decide what language will live in your head before any price can argue. This is the power of routine. It creates a stable operating context, so the same rules produce the same behavior under different moods and different market weather. A pre-market routine is the moment you move from person to operator. You transition from wanting to make money to running a method with a small advantage. You load definitions into working memory. You anchor identity to process rather than outcome. You bind risk to numbers rather than to feeling. You remove negotiation from boundaries by deciding them in advance. You give your nervous system a pattern it can trust, so it does not try to protect you with impulse when uncertainty rises. The goal is not to feel confident. The goal is to be competent at the exact actions that allow expectancy to express. Confidence will appear as a side effect of repeatable execution. This routine begins with meaning. You define a good day in terms of fidelity to specification and respect for limits. You speak one line that will govern the entire session. You say that success today is measured by rule adherence, risk containment, selection discipline, and closure on time. You accept that profit and loss will fluctuate while you practice fidelity. You accept that boredom is part of winning because it prevents low-quality action. You accept that losses will occur at planned size and that this is a sign of integrity, not a sign of failure. Meaning comes first because meaning selects attention and attention selects action. Then you define the container. You fix the start and end time, and you accept them as non-negotiable boundaries. You choose the instruments that are authorized and the time references that carry authority. You set the daily risk budget in absolute terms, and you translate that budget into per trade size and maximum trade count. You write these values once so they stop being options later. You declare flat as the default state, and you require complete confirmation to leave that state. By doing this, you make inaction the baseline and action the exception that must be earned. Most errors are prevented right here because most errors are born from acting, while confirmation is partial. You align method and environment. You look at volatility, liquidity, and session structure in neutral terms, and you compare them to the conditions your method is built to exploit. You decide whether today is inside plan or outside plan. If it is outside plan, you reduce activity or choose no trade, and you mark that choice in your journal so you cannot negotiate later. If it is inside plan, you proceed without adding new ambitions. You check scheduled events that can change conditions in your window. You decide now whether your method tolerates trading through them or requires a pause. You record the decision so you do not let excitement erase it when speed increases. You load the rules into focus. You read selection criteria, entry timing, exit logic, and abort conditions exactly as written. Reading out loud slows the mind and turns knowledge into present context. You do not add rules and you do not remove rules. You honor change control and leave edits for review, windows. This protects attribution and keeps the system coherent. You set up the workspace to match the plan and nothing more. You open only the charts and tools the method needs. You remove commentary feeds and social inputs that inject foreign incentives. You set order defaults to the plan size. You confirm that stops and exits can be placed quickly without friction. You put the reference time frame at the center so context leads and execution view follows. You prime risk and pace. You convert the risk unit into concrete sizes given current volatility so you do not improvise under stress. You rehearse the act of closing the platform at the daily drawdown boundary so the brain recognizes it as normal. You set a minimum observation period before the first trade and a mandatory pause after every exit. You set a limit on the number of decisions in the first hour so arousal cannot trick you into front-loading mistakes. You decide that any confusion will be met by reduction of inputs rather than by adding more. All of this is written once at the start, so emotion cannot rewrite it mid-session. You calibrate attention on purpose. You widen gaze to recover context, then narrow to execution view, then widen again. You move across time references in a fixed order, so your brain learns to link details back to structure. You speak a single operator line that defines your role, and you repeat it until your pace slows. You set the language for the day. You replace hope statements with operational statements. You replace "I need this to work" with "the edge is present and the risk is defined." You replace "I cannot take another loss" with "the next decision will be sized within limits and judged by rules." Words are code. Code shapes state. State shapes execution. You open the journal as a live cockpit. You pre-fill the date, the session window, the authorized instruments, the risk budget, and the intent line. You insert the check prompts you will speak before any order and the micro-audit questions you will answer after each decision block. The journal is not a memoir. It is the audit surface that keeps you honest in real time. When the routine is complete, you have already made the most important choices of the day. The meaning of success is fixed. The boundaries are fixed. The method is loaded. The environment posture is chosen. The tools are ready. The language is clean. The plan will instruct, and the chart will inform. Now you can begin the session without negotiating with emotion or randomness. An in-session routine is the set of actions that keeps the operator stable while prices move and arousal fluctuates. The session opens with a brief orientation that bridges pre-market preparation to live execution. You read the intent line that defines the role, glance at the reference time frame to anchor context, verify that the environment filter remains true, and confirm that the risk budget and decision limits are loaded in working memory. This takes seconds and prevents the first burst of motion from setting the tone. The default state is flat. You remain in that state until complete confirmation is present. You do not drift into action through partial signals. You require a full chain of conditions in the planned order. Each decision passes through gates that return yes or no. If any gate returns no, the sequence terminates and you return to observation without commentary. The routine standardizes pace. The first hour uses narrow decision bandwidth because physiology is still calibrating. You set a minimum observation period before the first trade, and you cap the number of decisions in that opening window. You insert a mandatory pause after every exit long enough to recover context and to run a quick checklist. The pause is not a suggestion. It is a structural element that breaks emotional carryover between decisions. You keep hands off the controls during pauses to prevent impulse clicks. Attention is managed by design. You look at the reference time frame first and the execution view second, so higher order structure leads. You restrict inputs to the signals defined in the method. You keep unrelated instruments, commentary, and opinion streams closed. If arousal rises, you reduce data rather than add it. You widen gaze to recover peripheral awareness, breathe to a steady cadence, and speak one neutral operator line that reasserts authority of rules over urges. Language remains operational at all times. You describe the state of the trade in terms of premises and rules. The premise is intact, or the premise is broken. The exit rule is pending, or the exit rule has fired. There is no room for hope statements and no room for fear statements. The market owes you nothing, and you owe the plan fidelity. Entries are executed once and cleanly when the chain of confirmations is complete. Protective orders are placed immediately, so the cost of being wrong is fixed. You do not widen stops. You do not remove stops. And you do not convert a rule-based exit into a negotiation. If the invalidation level is hit, you accept the planned loss and you exit at the first valid moment. If the realization rule fires, you take it without delay. If an abort condition appears, such as a platform fault, a data outage, or an environment shift that the plan defines as hostile, you flatten first and then diagnose. Scaling is either part of the method or it does not exist. If it exists, it is rare, rule-based, and only occurs after favorable movement at locations that improve probability or reduce risk. Adds are never used to rescue a losing position. Reductions are predefined actions that reduce exposure while the premise remains intact. If scaling is not in the specification, you do not invent it mid-session. Risk and exposure are capped by rules, not by mood. The maximum number of simultaneous positions, the maximum exposure, the maximum trade count, and the daily drawdown limit are structural boundaries. When a boundary is reached, you stop for the day. You do not negotiate with yourself, and you do not try for one more to repair feeling. These limits protect the machine so it can operate tomorrow. Independence between decisions is enforced. The next action is evaluated as if the day has just begun. The last outcome does not change selection criteria or position size. A short sequence of words reinforces this independence. The next decision is independent. The size is fixed by plan. The rule will judge the action. This keeps recency from contaminating execution. The journal is used in real time as an audit surface rather than as a narrative device. Before any order you speak, the pre-trade prompts and mark that all gates returned, yes. At entry, you record entry time, price, size, and confirmation that protective and exit instructions exist. During the trade, you record only rule-relevant events. At exit, you record the exit type and the time from signal to action. After exit, you mark pause, start, and pause, end. This minimal set of fields is enough to compute adherence and to detect hesitation without stealing attention from execution. Micro resets are part of the routine, and they are triggered by specific events. They run after any loss, after any deviation, and after any noticeable spike in arousal. The reset has 3 steps. Breathe to a fixed count. Widen gaze and step back to the reference time frame. Read the intent line that re-anchors. Identity to operator. Only then do you evaluate the next opportunity. This sequence converts physiological spikes into brief events rather than into cascades that distort the rest of the session. Time is treated as a risk parameter. You respect the session end boundary and any intra-session breaks defined in the plan. You step away on schedule even when the screen feels magnetic. Ending on time restores credibility to limits and trains the nervous system to accept closure without forcing a narrative repair trade. Environmental hygiene supports the routine. You keep the workspace free of clutter and free of changing layouts. You limit the number of open charts to those required by the method. You maintain consistent color schemes and annotation styles so the eye recognizes signals quickly. Hotkeys and order templates are configured to prevent oversizing and accidental orders. Any tool that increases speed must also increase safety. Energy management is embedded. Hydration, posture checks, and brief movement breaks occur at preset intervals. You protect glucose and attention because both are inputs to decision quality. Fatigue is treated as a hostile environment condition. If it appears you reduce activity or end the session, you do not attempt to outwill a tired brain. Handling news and event risk is pre-decided. If the plan allows trading through events, you maintain size and rules exactly as written. If the plan requires a pause, you flatten and remain flat until the window passes. You do not chase the first move after an event. You wait for your conditions to reappear because your edge lives in your conditions, not in excitement. Missed entries are handled without drama. If the market moves without you, while confirmation is incomplete, you record pass and remain flat. This is not an error. It is evidence that restraint is working. Attempting to re-enter late degrades expectancy and teaches the brain that rules are negotiable. The routine converts these temptations into moments of proof that the operator identity holds. Error handling is immediate and non-judgmental. When a deviation is detected, you flatten if necessary, and you apply the predefined consequence, such as a longer pause or a size reduction for a fixed number of decisions. You write one neutral line that names the deviation in operational terms, and you move on. The goal is containment and learning, not punishment. The in-session routine ends with clean closure. You respect the end time or the risk cap. You close the platform, and you transition to the debrief container. There is no final trade to fix a feeling, and there is no quick look back that invites rumination. Closure protects attention for tomorrow and proves that boundaries are real. When this routine runs, live execution becomes predictable. The plan instructs, the chart informs, and emotion is observed without authority. Variance remains because variance is the nature of markets. But your behavior stops varying with mood. This invariance is what allows a small statistical edge to show up in real results. A post-market routine is the container that turns a trading day into lessons without letting memory rewrite events. It begins at the boundary you set, either the planned end time or the moment the risk cap is reached. You close the platform to remove fresh stimuli, and you open your journal and the account statement side by side. You verify that every action on the statement has a corresponding journal line. If an action exists without a record, you mark a deviation and accept the predefined consequence. You then reconstruct the day as a sequence of specifications and results rather than as a story. You compute adherence rate as the percentage of decisions that satisfied every gate before action. You count deviations and classify them by type, such as early entry, late exit, stop moved, pause skipped, boundary breached, or unauthorized instrument. You calculate pause compliance and boundary integrity. You measure the average delay from signal to action and the average slippage relative to plan so hesitation and friction can be observed. You compare adverse and favorable excursions to their planned counterparts to detect drift in holding behavior. You record the number of valid setups passed and the number of invalid setups avoided because passing on noise preserves edge and deserves visibility. With measurement complete, you perform a simple classification. Was the method applied as written or not? Was the environment within plan or not? Only when the method was applied inside the planned environment do you attribute a loss to variance. Everything else is process, and process can be improved. If the method was not applied, you call it discipline failure, and you choose the smallest guardrail that prevents recurrence, such as lengthening the mandatory pause, reducing the maximum trade count for a fixed period, or rewriting a rule in plainer language. If the environment was outside plan, you call it filter failure, and you tighten the definition of acceptable conditions or commit to a no-trade posture when those conditions appear. If both method and environment were off, you halt experimentation and simplify until coherence returns. Root cause work is conducted in neutral language. You ask whether specification was unclear, whether attention collapsed, whether arousal spiked, whether tools misfired, or whether fatigue created time pressure. You resolve unclear specification by rewriting the line into observable conditions that an external observer could verify. You resolve attention and arousal issues by binding the micro-reset routine to new triggers such as any deviation flag or any detectable rise in heart rate or breath rate. You resolve tool issues by testing order routing and controls in a safe environment before the next live session. You resolve fatigue by reducing session length or by inserting a scheduled break that is mandatory. You extract one lesson only. You select a single behavior to keep and a single adjustment to test tomorrow. You write each in one sentence. The keep sentence preserves a strength and anchors identity to execution. The test sentence names a tiny change that targets the most frequent or most costly defect. You do not implement multiple edits. You respect change control because many small untested edits create a different system that cannot be audited. You update the changelog with 3 simple lines. Why the change is proposed, what hypothesis it expresses, and how it will be evaluated over a specific sample. You set a review window so results are not judged by a handful of outcomes. You keep everything else invariant so attribution remains possible. You adjust risk posture only through rules, not through mood. If adherence was high and results were red, but inside the expected drawdown envelope, you change nothing and you continue to collect sample size. If adherence was low, you cut size or frequency for a fixed number of trades to create space for discipline to recover. If a boundary breach occurred, you impose an automatic shorter session tomorrow or a lower daily risk cap for a fixed period to retrain respect for limits. You convert numbers into a short closure note free of drama. You state whether the day was professionally strong or weak based on adherence and boundaries rather than on money. You write the operator line that will open tomorrow and you close the journal. You deliberately exit the trading context so the brain can consolidate learning without new inputs. You avoid platform rechecks, and you avoid social comparison because both reopen loops that closure just sealed. Recovery is part of the routine. You hydrate, you eat, you move, and you sleep. You allow physiology to reset so the next session begins with a full battery rather than a deficit that invites impulse. On a weekly cadence, you roll up the daily audits. You aggregate adherence, deviation types, pause compliance, boundary, integrity, slippage, and delay. You compare realized distribution to the expected distribution for your method. If realized behavior was clean and the environment was within plan and expectancy still underperforms, you consider method refinement inside a formal review window. You test on historical data if applicable. Observe forward with small size, and then decide whether to adopt the change. You document the decision so performance shifts can be attributed later. A post-market routine is not a ceremony to feel better. It is a machine for keeping the process honest. It teaches the nervous system that safety comes from rules that survive contact with volatility. It teaches the mind that losses are invoices that purchase information and that information purchases better specifications. When this loop runs, daily, the system becomes simpler. The left tail is protected by limits, and the edge is allowed to express because nothing in the process is negotiating with emotion. A weekly review routine is the mechanism that converts scattered days into a coherent operating system. It aggregates behavior, separates variance from drift, and schedules change only when evidence justifies it. Begin by defining the review window and honoring it. Intraday systems review weekly. Swing systems may review monthly. Do not shorten the window because of mood. The window anchors patience and ensures that edits are made on a sample, not on a story. Load the week's journal data and the account statement side by side. Verify data integrity first, so conclusions rest on facts. Compute adherence rate across the full sample for entries, exits, pauses, risk caps, and session boundaries. Count deviations by type and rank them by frequency and cost. Measure average delay from signal to action and average slippage versus plan to reveal hesitation and execution friction. Summarize boundary integrity by stating how many times session end, daily drawdown, or max trade count were respected or breached. Tally valid setups passed and invalid. Setups avoided to quantify selectivity. With mechanics measured. Examine realized distribution against expected distribution for your method. Look at win rate, average win, average loss, payoff ratio, average hold time, and the depth and length of drawdown. Compare these to your pre-computed envelopes for the system. If behavior was clean and the environment matched plan and results still live inside the envelopes, you do nothing. You keep running the machine. If behavior drifted, you fix behavior before touching rules. Only when behavior is clean and results deviate outside the envelope do you consider method changes. Classify each week's outcomes on a 2x2 grid. Method applied or not. Environment in plan or not. This classification dictates action. Method applied and environment in plan points to variance. Method not applied points to discipline work through constraints, smaller size, or fewer trades for a fixed number of sessions. Environment out of plan points to better filters or to honoring a no-trade posture under specific conditions. Both off points to simplification and a reset of specifications to restore coherence. Change control is formal. You maintain a change log that records every edit with 3 lines. The reason for the change, the hypothesis the change expresses, and the evaluation plan, including the sample size and metrics that will decide. Changes are small and singular. You do not stack edits. You adopt one change, forward, observe with reduced size, and keep everything else invariant. Only after the evaluation window do you retain or revert. This prevents drift and preserves the ability to attribute performance shifts to specific causes. Use the review to harden language. Rewrite any vague rule into an observable condition that a third party could verify by looking at the chart and the timestamp. Replace ambiguous phrases like strong momentum with specific definitions tied to your reference timeframe and your trigger conditions. Replace trade if it feels extended with a rule that speaks to distance from reference, time, since last retrace, or volatility bands defined in advance. Language precision tightens execution because it removes the last refuge of impulse, which is interpretation. Evaluate risk posture at the system level. Confirm that per trade risk, daily risk cap, and maximum concurrent exposure are appropriate for the realized volatility of the instruments you traded. If realized volatility increased and slippage widened, consider reducing size per decision or limiting simultaneous positions to keep left tail risk capped. If realized volatility decreased and fills were clean, you can maintain size or scale only according to a pre-written policy tied to adherence and drawdown recovery, not to recent profits. You do not scale up because of euphoria. You scale according to rules that protect the machine. Inspect your environment filters for robustness. Ask whether the week's conditions met your plan's definition of tradable regime. If the plan admitted too many low-quality sessions, refine the filter. If it excluded too many valid sessions, loosen it with a hypothesis you will test. Use out-of-sample checks when possible so you are not fitting rules to last week's tape. Keep filters simple enough to execute without debate. Run a tool audit. Confirm that layout. Order templates, hotkeys, and data sources supported speed without increasing risk. If any friction appeared, fix it now. If any new tool is considered, add it only if it removes a failure mode or reduces cognitive load. Tools must lower entropy, not raise it. Additions are tested in simulation or with trivial size during an evaluation window. Do not add shiny objects mid-session next week. Establish a scoreboard of professionalism that you carry forward. Record adherence rate, deviation frequency by type, boundary, integrity, pause, compliance, rule, clarity, defects discovered and fixed, and change log completeness. These are leading indicators of durability. Treat improvements in these numbers as primary wins. Money is recorded, but it does not define whether the week was strong or weak. If money and professionalism diverge, you side with professionalism because it is the lever you control. Schedule your research window distinctly from your operation window. Research time is where you explore refinements. Read. Test hypotheses on historical data when appropriate. And forward, observe potential rules. Operation time is where you run the current specification. Never mix the two. Mixing is how systems become incoherent. Research produces a proposal that enters the changelog. Operation runs the plan. Close the weekly review with a single constraint and a single commitment. The constraint is what you will not do next week, such as no discretionary edits in session, no new instruments, or no size increases regardless of outcomes. The commitment is the one behavior or rule you will emphasize, such as enforcing the pause, ending on time, or speaking operational language aloud at decision points. You write both in one line each so the brain can hold them under load. A monthly or quarterly review extends the same logic across a larger window. You evaluate regime shifts, edge stability across environments, and capacity to scale within risk limits. You study whether the system remains simple, whether rules have proliferated, and whether any component has become too clever to execute when arousal is high. You simplify again. You archive what you learned in a concise operator note, so future you inherits clarity rather than a pile of files. The weekly routine ends with a reset of meaning. You reaffirm that success is defined by fidelity to specification, boundary, integrity, and clean execution. You reaffirm that your identity is operator, not predictor. You reaffirm that variance is the invoice you pay to stay in the game. Then you step away. The next time you sit down at the screen, the machine you run will be tighter because you use the week to remove drift instead of to add complexity. A monthly reset routine widens the lens beyond single sessions and single weeks, so the operating system can be simplified and strengthened. You begin by restating the objective of the method in one clear sentence, so every decision downstream serves the same aim. You pull the last month of audits and confirm that data integrity is intact. You look for structural drift rather than short-term noise. You ask whether rules multiplied, whether language softened, whether boundaries were negotiated, and whether selection loosened. If complexity has grown, you subtract until the core edge is visible again. If language has become vague, you rewrite it into observable conditions that you can execute under pressure. If boundaries were bent, you design an automatic consequence that restores credibility. The monthly reset also evaluates regime alignment. You compare the environment your plan intends to trade with the environment you actually traded. If the month delivered regimes your filters should have excluded, you formalize a tighter filter. If quality periods were skipped because the filter was too strict, you loosen it with a written hypothesis and a forward observation plan. You then audit risk posture at the higher level. You test whether per-trade risk, daily risk cap, and concurrent exposure remain appropriate for realized volatility, liquidity, and slippage. If the left tail widened, you reduce size or concurrency by rule. If fills were clean, you maintain size rather than reflexively expand. Scaling occurs only according to a pre-written policy based on adherence and drawdown recovery, never on mood or recent profit. You complete the reset by updating the changelog with a small number of precise edits and an evaluation window that will decide whether each edit stays or goes. Everything else remains invariant, so attribution is possible. An energy and attention routine anchors the biology that runs the method. You treat sleep as a hard prerequisite for risk. If sleep quality or duration falls below a personal threshold, you reduce activity or stand down. You normalize hydration and simple nutrition, so glucose and electrolytes support cognition. You schedule short movement breaks in advance and honor them even when you feel fine, so the habit exists before stress arrives. You protect attention by removing variable inputs. You keep the workspace minimalist with stable layouts and quiet colors. You block distracting sites and commentary during trading hours. You train the nervous system with a tiny daily breath practice that you can run in under 2 minutes on command, so state regulation is available inside the session without tools. You decide the maximum total screen time per day and per week, and you honor it because a depleted brain invites impulse. You place recovery on the calendar with the same seriousness as entries. Days off are part of the edge because they preserve decision quality. A training routine keeps skills sharp without risking capital. You schedule simulator sessions or micro-sized drills to rehearse the full decision sequence at least once per week. You practice the pre-trade checklist, the entry, the placement of protective orders, the execution of exits, the pause, and the micro-audit. You practice the abort protocol, so flattening feels normal when required. You rehearse the boundary halt at the daily risk cap, so the body knows the sequence without argument. You run a language drill where you speak the operator line and a few rule statements in plain voice to strengthen the mapping between words and actions. You test platform contingencies by simulating a data outage or a hotkey misfire and confirming the immediate response. Training is short and focused. It exists to make execution automatic when arousal rises. A scaling routine governs how risk changes over time. You set clear prerequisites. Adherence rate remains above a chosen threshold across a full review window. Boundary integrity is perfect. Deviation frequency is trending down. And drawdown has recovered to within a defined fraction of equity. Only when all prerequisites hold do you increase risk by a small, fixed increment. You run the new size for another window while watching the same professionalism metrics. If they hold, you keep the size. If they degrade, you step back automatically. You never stack increases. You never scale intra-week. You never scale because you feel hot. You scale because the machine earned it through stability. An emergency halt routine protects the machine when rare conditions appear. You define triggers such as a platform failure, a feed anomaly, an execution error that leaves unprotected exposure, a severe personal distraction, or any breach of the daily drawdown. The rule is flatten first, then diagnose. After flattening, you run a brief checklist that decides whether the session is over or whether a reduced state is allowed. The language is neutral, so you cannot negotiate with stress. The goal is containment. The secondary goal is preserving audit trails, so learning survives the event. A one-page operator manual compresses the system into a control surface you can use in real time. It begins with the single sentence that defines a good day inside this method, so meaning cannot be hijacked mid-session. It lists the authorized instruments and time references in plain words so you do not wander. It states the risk unit, the maximum daily loss, the maximum number of trades, and the concurrency limit, so boundaries are visible. It describes the environment filter in a few lines that are observable without interpretation. It states the selection criteria, the entry, timing instruction, the protective order rule, the exit rule, and the abort conditions in simple sentences that begin with action verbs. It includes the pre-trade prompts you will speak, the in-trade monitoring phrase that keeps attention on premises rather than on hope, and the micro-reset steps to run after any spike in arousal. It ends with the closure ritual and the 2 audit questions that define the post-market review. This manual lives on your desk. You read it before the session, and you glance at it when uncertainty tries to invent new options. A life integration routine prevents conflict between trading and the rest of your responsibilities. You schedule sessions when you can be uninterrupted. You inform people who share your space that trading blocks are quiet blocks. You keep a buffer between the end of the session and other obligations so the mind can decompress and the journal can be written without rush. You protect relationships by showing up on time and present after the screen turns off. This stability reduces background stress and frees capacity for discipline. Finally, you formalize a call-to-action routine that builds community and accountability. At the end of study or review, you write one plain sentence that states the single behavior you will emphasize next session. You post it where you will see it when you sit down. You engage with peers only in a way that reinforces rules, rather than in a way that invites prediction contests. You choose inputs that elevate professionalism and mute noise. You treat each routine as a lever that keeps the system coherent across weeks and months. When these routines run, your days become simpler. Your variance becomes tolerable, and your edge is allowed to express because nothing is left to negotiation. If this structure resonates and you want continued guidance at this level, make a deliberate decision to keep learning with flow state trading. Subscribe and turn on notifications so the next training on compact operator manuals and live execution drills meets you at the right time. Like and share this with someone who needs a working routine rather than a new indicator. In a comment, write one routine you will install today and the exact sentence that defines it. Then show up tomorrow and keep the promise.